Lara floated through the cold void of space, her breath steady as she scanned the wreckage of a long-forgotten ship, drifting silently in the endless expanse of the uncharted sector of space. It had taken her days to find this derelict ship, and though the prize seemed distant, the risk was always worth it. After all, she was a scavenger, a girl from a small mining colony. With little more than her wits and a desire to survive, she knew the value of forgotten tech. She knew how to find it, and how to extract it without ever alerting the larger factions who would fight to control it. The ship she had discovered was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its hull was adorned with intricate alien symbols, and its structure was far more advanced than the crew human ships that made up most of the mining fleet. It had been drifting for centuries, lost in time. The records told of a ship that had once belonged to an ancient race now gone, but its technology remained. The data in her datapad was fragmented and vague, but the telltale signs of a valuable find were clear. As she entered the ship's darkened docking bay, her heart raced. The air was stale and thick with the weight of abandonment, but there was something almost alive about it, like the ship was waiting for her. Its silence unsettling, but not unfamiliar. She had been in enough ruins to know the feeling of stepping into the forgotten relics of history. But this place felt different. It felt as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for her to disturb them. Lara moved cautiously through the corridors of the ship, her boots echoing softly in the hollow quiet. Each step she took seemed to set off a chain reaction within the vessel. Lights flickered to life, and the hum of dormant systems began to pulse around her. A low vibration coursed through the floor beneath her feet. It wasn't just power being restored. The ship was awakening. Something was happening, something she hadn't anticipated. She rounded a corner and came upon a massive chamber, its size overwhelming. She could barely make sense of the strange machinery and the symbols etched into the walls. As she ventured further into the room, a pedestal emerged from the floor, the material smooth and metallic. It glowed with an eerie light. At the center of the pedestal rested something wrapped in shadow. It was a suit, but not like anything she had ever seen. It was sleek, angular, and designed with an elegance that spoke of purpose. Its surface was covered in shifting patterns that seemed to react to her presence. Instinctively, she reached out, and as her fingers brushed the cool surface of the suit, the room shifted around her. The walls seemed to pulse, and a low hum filled the air. The suit seemed to respond to her touch, as if it had been waiting for her. Its energy surged through the room, enveloping her. She hesitated, but her curiosity overpowered her caution. She stepped forward, and with a deep breath, she pulled the suit toward her, as if it were calling to her in a way she couldn't explain. The moment she slipped into the suit, something extraordinary happened. A burst of energy surged through her body. Her senses heightened. Everything around her became crystal clear. The air tasted sharper. The vibrations of the ship felt alive beneath her. The suit fit perfectly, as if it were made for her. She could feel the intricate network of systems within it syncing with her thoughts. It was more than just a piece of technology. It was a living entity reacting to her every move. Lara gasped, her mind struggling to process the flood of information that came pouring into her consciousness. She felt an overwhelming sense of power rushing through her veins, an unfamiliar and terrifying sensation. It was as though she had tapped into something ancient, something beyond her understanding. The suit was connected to her in ways she couldn't explain, and in that moment, she realized she wasn't just wearing it, she had become a part of it. The ship groaned as if in response to her awakening, and with a sudden jolt, the hull vibrated. A warning flashed across the interface of the suit, a foreign language one she couldn't understand. The symbols scrambled in her mind, but before she could make sense of it, a voice echoed through the ship, deep and resonant. It wasn't speaking to her directly, but she could hear the words clear as day, as if they were meant for someone else. "Do not wear this, it is not meant for you." The words reverberated through her mind, leaving a chill in their weight. The warning was clear, but it didn't stop her curiosity. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took another step forward. She couldn't turn back now. Whatever this was, it had chosen her, and she had no idea what was about to unfold, but she knew one thing: this ship and the suit had changed everything, and she was no longer just a scavenger. She was part of something far larger, something far more dangerous. Laura stood still as the voice echoed in her mind, the warning repeating over and over again. The words felt heavy, as if the ship itself was trying to tell her something important. But she couldn't focus on that, not now. She felt the power of the suit coursing through her like a current of pure energy. Her senses were sharp and alert. She could feel the hum of the ship, the pulse of the technology. Beneath her skin, the suit was alive, and it had chosen her. But for what purpose she couldn't yet comprehend. The moment she took a step forward, the suit seemed to respond instinctively, a subtle shift in its structure and a flicker of light along the edges of the suit's surface, as though it were communicating with the ship around her. She could hear the ship's systems groaning to life around her, circuits humming with power, machinery shifting into motion. And in that instant, she felt an overwhelming urge to move forward, to explore, to push deeper into the heart of this ancient vessel. But then the power surged again, and it wasn't just a feeling, it was physical. The energy that had been dormant in the suit exploded within her veins. She staggered for a moment, trying to hold on to her sense of control, but it was impossible. The power was like nothing she had ever experienced in her life. Her hands shot out in front of her instinctively, and the walls of the ship rippled. The very air around her bent and twisted, as if her thoughts alone could shape the world around her. The suit was amplifying her will in ways that defied reason. Laura gasped as she tried to pull back, but it was too late. The energy was too much, the force of it tearing through her focus, her mind racing to process everything. But it was impossible. The flood of power made everything feel slow and yet impossibly fast. She could hear every creak of the ship, every pulse of the machinery. As it awakened, she could see the outlines of the energy around her, almost like a web weaving itself through the ship. Her senses expanded beyond anything she could have imagined. And then it stopped. Everything fell quiet. The energy receded, and Lyra was left standing there, her heart pounding in her chest, trying to comprehend what had just happened. She looked around the room, and for the first time realized how much had changed around her. The walls were covered in cracks, as if the sheer force of her thoughts had bent them out of shape. The air shimmered faintly with residual energy, and the suit was humming softly against her skin, almost as if it were waiting for her to do something. Laura took a deep breath, steadying herself. The warning, the voice, the overwhelming power, it was all too much, too fast. And she was beginning to fear what might happen next. Was she even in control of this power? Or was she at the mercy of something far greater than herself? She knew she needed to understand what this suit was and what it had to do with her. But first she needed to regain her composure. She needed to calm the storm inside her, but still raged with the raw energy of the suit. She closed her eyes and took another breath, feeling the pulse of the suit against her skin. She focused on that feeling, the connection the suit had with her. And as she did, she could sense something else, something deeper within the vessel, something calling to her. She opened her eyes and followed the pull. The ship seemed to guide her toward another chamber, a larger room, its doors slowly opening as she approached. Inside the room was a large holographic display, and the walls were covered with strange alien symbols far more complex than anything she had seen so far. Lyra stepped inside, cautiously, her gaze drawn to the glowing symbols. The moment she crossed the threshold, the ship's voice spoke again, this time clearer, more direct. "You are not ready," it warned her, but Lyra was already moving forward. She had no choice but to keep going. The mysteries of the suit, the ship, everything about it were pulling her forward, and there was no turning back now. She reached out her hand toward the holographic display, and as soon as she touched it, the symbols flashed brightly, and a surge of information flooded her mind. The ship's history, its purpose, its creators, everything came crushing into her thoughts. That once the Aether, an ancient race of beings who had once ruled the stars, they had created the suit to defend against an enemy too powerful for them to defeat. But something had gone terribly wrong. They had disappeared, leaving the suit behind, and now it was hers, whether she was ready or not. Lyra's mind reeled as she tried to process it. All she understood now, that the power she wielded was part of something far greater than herself. But what did it mean for her? What was she meant to do with it? And why had it chosen her? These questions raced through her mind. But there was no time to find answers, not yet. She had a feeling that whatever was coming next would demand everything she had and more. Lyra stood frozen as the flood of information settled into her mind. Her head ached with the weight of the knowledge she had just absorbed. The symbols on the wall flickered before her eyes, as if trying to draw her deeper into their mystery. But something else was pressing at the edge of her awareness, a feeling of unease, as if something was watching her or waiting for her to make the wrong move. She tried to focus, but her mind was still reeling from the discovery, the Aethar, the ancient race that had created the suit, its purpose, the danger that it had been left behind to protect against. She stepped back from the holographic display, her breath shallow as the weight of her situation began to sink in. She had been chosen. But for what the suit had power far beyond her understanding. She had felt it surging through her body earlier, and the thought of it terrified her. The sudden surge, the uncontrollable force that had ripped through the ship. When she first touched the suit, it had felt almost too much to handle, and yet it was still there, humming just beneath the surface, ready to burst forth again at any moment. She turned quickly, her heart racing, as she tried to make sense of everything. She needed answers, but the ship was silent now. The voice that had warned her before was gone, leaving only the hum of ancient technology around her. Lyra clenched her fists and tried to steady herself. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. She had to understand the suit and what it meant for her before it consumed her completely. The ship seemed to beckon her forward, urging her to explore its depths. And without thinking, Lyra moved toward the next doorway, its surface sliding open smoothly as if expecting her. She stepped through into another chamber, and this one felt different. It was larger, more open, its walls lined with rows of strange alien artifacts, and in the center stood a pedestal holding a glowing orb. The air around it seemed to shimmer with energy, and Lyra felt an immediate pull toward it. She couldn't explain why, but she knew she had to approach it. As she reached out to touch the orb, the suit hummed again, its energy reacting to the object, as if recognizing something hidden within it. The moment her fingers brushed against the surface of the orb, a shock of electricity shot through her body, and the chamber exploded with light. The walls around her cracked and shifted as the power in the room surged. Lyra gasped as her senses were overwhelmed. With the rush of energy, everything became distorted, her vision blurred, and her thoughts scattered in a dizzying whirl. The orb pulsed once more, and suddenly the light died down, leaving her standing in the center of the room, panting, the world around her still and silent. But something had changed. Lyra could feel it in her bones. A shift had occurred within her. The suit's power had grown stronger, its presence more pronounced. And there was something else too, a dark weight pressing against her thoughts, a whispering presence, as if the very ship itself had begun to take an interest in her. Lyra stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. The orb had done something to her. It had unlocked something within the suit, something hidden deep within its structure. But what she didn't know, she felt the power coursing through her veins again, more intense than before. It was no longer just a tool at her disposal. It was part of her, part of who she was, and it was clear that it had no intention of letting her go. The room seemed to close in around her, and she fought the panic rising in her chest. She had to control this, she had to. But the more she tried, the harder it became. The suit's power was overwhelming, its influence seeping into her mind and emotions. She had never felt anything like it before. It was as if the very fabric of the ship was alive with energy waiting for her command. Suddenly, a voice broke through the chaos, but it wasn't the ship's voice. It was her own voice, a whisper in the back of her mind, as if the suit itself was speaking directly to her. Embrace it. It said softly, embrace the power. You are not meant to fight it, you are meant to wield it. The words sent a chill down her spine as they echoed in her mind. Lyra knew she had no choice now. She had to understand what this power was, what the suit wanted from her. But before she could process any further, a new sound reached her ears, a distant rumble vibrating through the ship, followed by a series of sharp metallic cracks. Lyra's eyes widened in horror. The ship was under attack. Someone had found her. The hunt was on, and they weren't going to wait for her to figure out how to control this power. She had no time to lose. The battle for survival was beginning, and Lyra knew she was the only one who could fight back now. whether she was ready or not. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as the rumbling grew louder, the sound of metal groaning and crashing echoing through the ship. She could feel the vibrations under her feet, the power within the suit, still throbbing with energy, as if it could sense the threat approaching. It didn't matter that she wasn't ready, that she had no control over the suit anymore. The ship was under attack, and she was its last line of defense. The urgency of the situation pressed against her thoughts, and she had no time to waste. Without thinking, she rushed through the corridors, her movements swift and instinctive, the suit guiding her as much as she was trying to guide it. The walls seemed to shift around her as she ran, the alien symbols glowing faintly, as if alive, responding to her presence. She barely noticed them, now focused solely on the growing threat ahead. She knew she had to find the source of the attack before it was too late, before they got to her, before they destroyed everything. She rounded a corner and came face to face with the source of the disturbance, a group of alien mercenaries, their weapons drawn and their eyes scanning the darkness of the ship. They had found her, they had come for the suit, and Lyra knew that if they got it their hands, the power would fall into the wrong hands. The thought made her blood run cold. The suit was too dangerous to fall into anyone's control, especially not theirs. She hesitated for only a moment before she acted. The suit responded automatically, her body moving with a fluid grace that was beyond her own natural abilities. In an instant, she raised her arm and a pulse of energy shot from her fingertips, slamming into the first mercenary and sending him crashing into the wall, his body crumpling into a heap of twisted metal and broken bones. The others turned toward her, their eyes widening in shock. The suit's power was beyond anything she had imagined. She felt a rush of exhilaration as her movements became more precise, faster than she could ever move on her own. The suit allowed her to control the environment around her with nothing more than a thought. The next mercenary lunged at her with a blade, but she barely had to move to avoid the strike. She twisted her body as if the very air around her was part of the attack, and the mercenary was sent flying into the ceiling with a resounding crack. The remaining attackers tried to regroup, but Lyra was no longer thinking. She was acting, her movements smooth and lethal as she manipulated the suit's power with ease. Each pulse of energy she released from her hands seemed to carve through the air itself, disintegrating everything in its path. The walls shuddered with each strike, but the ship was resilient. It could withstand the chaos she was causing, but Lyra was afraid she wouldn't. She realized then that she wasn't just fighting for her survival, she was fighting for control. She was trying to keep from losing herself to the power that surged through her. It was too much, too overwhelming. And the more she used it, the more she felt it consuming her. Her thoughts began to blur as the suit took over her body. It felt like she was no longer just wearing the suit, she had become it, her will. And the suits were one, and that terrified her. She had no idea how far she could push herself before the line between them became impossible to separate. A shot rang out, and Lyra barely managed to dodge the blast. The beam singed the edge of her suit, and she felt the heat burn through her skin. She reacted instantly, raising her hand and sending a pulse of energy that sent the shooter flying backward, his body crashing into a nearby panel. But the brief moment of distraction was enough to make her falter, just enough to give the remaining mercenaries an opening. One of them fired again, and this time Lyra didn't react in time. The blast hit her square in the chest, and she was thrown backward onto the floor, the impact knocking the wind out of her. For a moment she lay there gasping, trying to clear her head. The suit had absorbed most of the damage, but the blast had still knocked her off balance. She tried to push herself up, but the power within her felt like it was draining away, leaving her weakened and vulnerable. She needed to get up, she needed to fight back. But her vision was blurring, and the pounding in her head was growing louder. She couldn't let them win, she couldn't let them take the suit. And then something inside her shifted. A quiet voice that wasn't hers whispered in the back of her mind, "Embrace it." The voice was calm, reassuring, and somehow familiar. It was the suit's voice. Lyra could feel its presence in her mind again, its ancient intelligence reaching out to her like a guiding hand. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The power surged once more, this time under her control, and she rose to her feet. The mercenaries hadn't expected her to recover so quickly, and when she moved again, it was with precision and grace. She barely had to think as she dismantled their weapons, one by one sending pulses of energy that disarmed them before they could react. The suit's power flowed through her with ease now, no longer overwhelming, but focused. She felt the line between herself and the suit fade away, and for the first time since she had put it on, she felt like she was in control. But she knew this was only the beginning. The mercenaries were only the first wave, and the ship was still under threat. She couldn't afford to be distracted by the power coursing through her. She needed to find the source of the attack and stop it before it was too late. Lyra stood amidst the wreckage of the mercenaries, her heart still racing from the fight. The suit hummed softly, as if pleased with her actions, but Lyra couldn't share in that satisfaction. Not yet. There was still so much she didn't understand about the power it gave her, the overwhelming force that seemed to push her closer to the edge of something she couldn't control. And as she lost herself in it, she feared she might never return. She took a slow breath and turned away from the fallen attackers. The corridors of the ship were still eerily silent now, but the sense of danger had not passed. The rumbling from earlier had not stopped, and the vibrations under her feet told her that more enemies were coming. The ship was in danger, and she was the only one who could protect it. But something about the growing presence of the suit unnerved her. It felt like the longer she stayed inside it, the less like herself she became. She shook her head, as if trying to clear the thoughts, but it didn't work. She needed to focus. She had no time for doubts. She had to keep moving. The ship wasn't just under attack, it was actively being torn apart, and whatever or whoever was behind this attack had to be stopped before they destroyed everything. Lyra moved quickly now, her steps sure, as she made her way deeper into the ship, her eyes scanning every corner as she passed. But it wasn't enough. The ship's damage was more severe than she'd realized. Entire sections were beginning to collapse, the lights flickering erratically, and the walls groaning under the strain of the assault. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together what had happened. How had they gotten inside the ship so easily? How had they known it was here? She reached a control room near the heart of the ship and quickly accessed the terminal. The alien symbols were still flashing across the interface, but now there were other warnings, 2 urgent messages flashing across the screen: systems failing, energy cores destabilizing, and then a set of coordinates at the bottom of the display. Lyra stared at them for a moment before she realized what they were: the location of the invaders, the ones who had breached the ship, and now were making their way toward its core. Lyra's eyes narrowed. She could feel the suit responding to the new information, as if it was preparing for something. The energy within it pulsed again, louder, now more insistent, and Lyra knew that this was the moment she had to act. There was no turning back. She could feel the suit trying to influence her again, urging her to embrace its power, to go beyond what she was capable of. But she resisted the urge to let it take over. She couldn't let it decide her actions, not yet. The map displayed on the terminal showed the enemy's position not far from the core, and the path ahead was filled with obstacles. But Lyra was no longer the scared girl from the mining colony. She was something else now, something more powerful, something that could survive this. But at what cost she didn't know, and it terrified her to think of what would happen if she crossed that line. She pushed forward down the hallway, her steps quicker, now more confident, but each pulse of power she used from the suit left her feeling more disconnected from herself, more distant from her own thoughts. It was a struggle to keep her focus, to not let the suit control her, and the deeper she went into the ship, the harder it became. She felt as though the ship itself was alive, feeding off the power of the suit, urging her onward. When she reached the enemy's location, she found them gathered around the ship's central control hub, a group of heavily armed mercenaries and soldiers scanning the area looking for any sign of resistance. Lyra didn't hesitate this time. She knew what she had to do. She raised her hands and felt the power surge within her, her thoughts blending with the suit's energy as she shaped it with ease. The mercenaries barely had time to react before the first pulse of energy slammed into them, sending them flying backward, their bodies crashing into walls and falling in a heap. The energy felt different now, though more controlled, less chaotic, and Lyra felt a surge of confidence course through her as she moved toward the remaining attackers. They fired at her, But their weapons were useless against the suit's power. She'd barely had to move to dodge the blasts, and when she struck again, she felt the force of the suit's energy tear through the room, sending the attackers into a disorienting frenzy before knocking them all unconscious. She stood there breathing heavily, the room silent now, except for the hum of the suit's power coursing through her veins. But her victory was short-lived. The walls trembled again, and a voice boomed over the ship's intercom, a harsh alien language that she didn't understand. But the tone was unmistakable. It was a threat, and it was clear that this battle was far from over. The invaders were still coming, and this time they wouldn't be so easy to defeat. Lyra's gaze hardened as she turned back toward the control room, her mind racing. She had no choice but to keep moving forward. The battle for the ship wasn't over yet, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let it fall into the wrong hands. Not now, not ever. The voice over the intercom sent a chill down Lyra's spine. It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. The invaders were coming for her, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted: the suit. She could feel it pulsing beneath her skin, its power responding to the danger, its presence growing more demanding, as though it were urging her to take control, to wield it with no hesitation. But Lyra was terrified of what would happen if she gave in completely. She couldn't let the suit dictate her actions. She couldn't let herself become another weapon of destruction. She had to stay in control. No matter how tempting it was to let the suit take over, the power was overwhelming. But the consequences of losing herself to it were too great. Lyra took a deep breath and stepped away from the control panel. She couldn't waste any more time. The invaders were closing in on the core, and if she didn't stop them, the entire ship would be lost. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: the ship was alive in its own way, and it was trying to protect her. It had chosen her to wield the suit's power, but she had to do it on her terms. Moving quickly now, she made her way deeper into the heart of the ship, the corridors twisting and turning, as if the ship itself was shifting to protect its core. She could feel the vibrations beneath her feet, growing stronger, the air growing heavier with each step. The deeper she went, the more she felt the weight of the ship's power pressing against her thoughts. It was as if the ship itself was calling out to her, urging her to unlock its full potential. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as she approached the central core. A chamber was vast and glowing with an eerie light, the walls lined with strange alien machinery, humming with energy. The invaders were there too, their leader, standing at the center of the room with his back to her. He was tall and imposing, his armor sleek and dark, his face hidden behind a helmet. But Lyra could feel his presence like a shadow in the room. He was the one responsible for the invasion, the one who had been hunting the suit, and now he was so close she could almost taste his fear. She didn't hesitate this time, her hands raised as she called on the suit's power. The energy surged around her, flowing through the air like a crackling storm. She could feel the weight of it in her chest, the raw intensity of it, as she unleashed a wave of force toward the invader. The room seemed to shake with the power of her strike, and the leader was sent flying backward, crashing into the wall, his armor denting under the force of the blast. But he didn't stay down for long. He pushed himself up slowly, his head turning toward her as he took off his helmet, revealing his face for the first time. He was older than she had expected, his eyes cold and calculating as he studied her. But there was something else in them, too, something that sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't afraid, he was fascinated, and that was worse than any fear. "So you are the one," his voice was calm, but edged with a deadly intensity. "The one who wields the suit's power. I've been hunting for you for a long time." His words sent a wave of dread through Lyra. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for control of the very power that he wanted. The leader took a step forward, and Lyra instinctively raised her hand again. The suit responded to her, with the air around her crackling with energy. But this time something was different. It wasn't just her power, it was the ship's power too. She could feel the connection between them growing stronger. The ship was becoming a part of her, a force she could tap into. And as she did, the suit's power expanded, filling the entire room with an overwhelming force. The invader raised his hand in response, and a shield of energy shimmered into existence, blocking her attack. The two forces collided in a massive explosion of light and sound. The entire chamber shaking with the impact. Lyra's teeth clenched as she pushed harder, her mind racing. She could feel the power building inside her, the suit, the ship, all of it coalescing into one unstoppable force. But as she pushed harder, she realized something terrifying. The more she used the power, the less control she had over it. The suit was feeding off her fear, her anger, her desperation. And with each passing second, it was pulling her deeper into its grip. She was losing herself to it, the voice in her mind, urging her to embrace the chaos, to let go of her humanity, and just become the weapon the suit was meant to create. The invader saw her struggle and smiled. It was the smile of someone who knew he had already won. Lyra's vision blurred as the pressure of the suit's energy pushed her to the edge of her limits. But she couldn't back down now. Not when she was so close to ending this. She had to find a way to break free from the suit's influence. She had to remember who she was and not let the power consume her completely. But the battle wasn't over yet. The invader wasn't finished, and the ship's core was still vulnerable. Lyra's mind raced as she searched for a way to regain control, but with every passing moment, it felt like she was sinking deeper into the storm of power that surrounded her. Lyra's heart raced as the energy around her crackled, her mind swimming in the chaos of power that surged through her veins. She could feel the invader's presence, pushing against her, the shield he had raised still holding strong against her attacks. But she knew she couldn't keep this up forever. The more she fought, the more the suit demanded from her. The more it tried to overwhelm her senses and thoughts like a hungry beast, gnawing at the edges of her consciousness. The invader's smile twisted with malice as he took a slow step forward, his hand still raised in defense, his eyes never leaving her face. "You think you can control it," he said, his voice calm and taunting. "You think you can fight the suit's power, but you can't. You are already lost." His words cut through her like a blade, his voice laced with truth. And for a moment, Lyra felt the cold grip of doubt tighten around her chest. Was he right? Had she already given herself over to the suit? She tried to shake off the feeling, but it only grew stronger. The power inside her was no longer just an ally. It was a force of nature beyond her understanding. And as it surged again, she felt the walls of her mind begin to crack. The suit's presence was overwhelming now, like a shadow covering everything else, and Lyra's thoughts became muddled. The fear that had once driven her to stay in control was slipping away. She couldn't hold on much longer. But then something inside her snapped. Something deep within her heart rose up and shouted against the darkness. It was a memory, a faint echo of who she used to be before the suit, before the power, before everything had gone so wrong. She remembered the people she had left behind on her colony, her family, her friends. They were depending on her. They had given her strength and courage. And she couldn't let them down, not now, not when everything was at stake. Lyra's hands shook as she lowered them. For a moment she didn't know if it was the suit or her own will, but she felt the pressure ease just enough for her to take a breath. She could feel the ship again, like a pulse beneath her feet, the hum of its ancient machinery, the whisper of its life calling out to her. It was as if the ship had become a part of her too, and it understood her struggle. It understood what she was fighting for. The invader noticed the shift in her eyes, and his smirk faltered for the first time. But he didn't hesitate. His energy shield flared brighter, and he took a step forward, determined to finish what he had started. His hand reaching for a weapon at his side. Lyra could see it in his eyes. He thought he had already won. He didn't understand that she wasn't just fighting for the suit. She was fighting for herself and for everything she still held dear. As he launched forward, Lyra felt the surge of power within her again. But this time it was different. It wasn't a violent storm of energy that she couldn't control. It was a wave of focused force, a pinpoint of strength and determination. She reached out, and the air around her seemed to bend to her, while she called on the ship's energy, and felt the very walls respond, the core of the ship pulsing with life, as if it too had awakened to her purpose. The invader's attack was cut short before it even began. The power of Lyra's strikes slammed into his shield and shattered it in an instant. The shockwave of energy sent him flying backward, his body slamming into the wall with a sickening thud. Lyra stood her ground, her breath coming in short gasps. but the power inside her was no longer an enemy. It was an extension of her. Will her purpose, she'd have found a balance between herself and the suit. The invader groaned from where he lay, his armor smoking from the impact. But he was not done yet. He pushed himself up slowly, his eyes narrowing with fury. Impossible. He spat the word like a curse. You should have been mine. You should have been controlled by the suit. But his voice wavered now. Lyra could see the cracks in his confidence. She had done it. She had broken through his belief that the suit could be tamed, that it could bend to anyone's will except her own. You don't control me. Lyra said, her voice steady now. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on his, her stance strong. And you will never control this ship. She raised her hands again, but this time it was with a sense of finality. She wasn't going to hold back anymore. The ship was hers to protect, and she would do whatever it took to keep it safe. With a single movement, she directed the power once more, and the invader's body was tossed across the room, his weapon slipping from his grasp. As he hit the ground, unable to rise again, the room was silent now, except for the faint hum of the suit, and the ship's heartbeat. Lyra stood there, her hands trembling but victorious. The ship had been saved for now, but she knew the battle was far from over. She had won this fight, but the invaders were not gone. Their leader might be defeated, but the threat still loomed, and Lyra knew she would have to face it again. But she also knew something else, something important. The power of the suit was hers to control. It didn't define her. It was part of her, but it didn't define who she was, and that was the first victory she had truly won. She had found her strength, not in the suit, but in herself. The room was still silent save for the soft hum of the ship's energy around her. Lyra stood over the defeated invader, her chest rising and falling. As she tried to catch her breath, the power that had once felt so foreign to her now seemed like an extension of herself. It was as though the suit had bonded with her in a way she couldn't fully explain. But one thing was clear. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled onto this ship. She had become something more, something capable of standing against a storm of power that threatened to tear everything apart. The invader groaned beneath her, his hand reaching for his weapon, but Lyra was already there. She moved with speed and precision, the suit reacting to her every thought. She didn't need to look at him anymore. She just knew what would happen next. She raised her hand, and with a single motion the invader's weapon was torn from his grasp, the suit's energy wrapping around it before sending it crashing against the wall harmlessly. He gasped in shock, his eyes wide, as he looked up at her, fear slowly replacing the arrogance that had filled them before. You don't know what you're doing, he said, his voice trembling for the first time. This ship is more than you can handle. You have no idea what you've unleashed. Lyra's gaze hardened. She wasn't about to let him dictate her actions, not anymore. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming him with the quiet authority she had just begun to understand. I don't need to understand everything about this ship to protect it, she said, her voice cold and steady. What I understand is that you and your people are a threat to everything I care about, and that ends now. The invader's eyes flicked to the walls, to the floor, as if looking for a way out, but there was none. He was trapped. His forces had been crushed, his plan undone. The ship was hers now, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. The suit had chosen her for a reason, and she had to honor that trust. She had to prove that she was worthy of its power. She took another step forward, and the invader winced as if expecting her to strike him down. But Lyra didn't move to hurt him. She wasn't like him. She wasn't going to become a monster just because she had the power to do so. Instead, she reached out her hand, offering him something he had never shown her: mercy. Leave this ship, she said, her voice firm. Take your forces and go before I decide to do more than just stop you. The invader's gaze flicked to her hand, as though he couldn't believe what she was offering, but then slowly, almost begrudgingly, he took a step back. You're making a mistake, he muttered, his voice low, but filled with venom. You'll regret this. Lyra watched as he turned and walked toward the door. He was beaten, but he wasn't broken, not yet. But she didn't care what he thought. He would live to see another day. But if he came back, it would be on her terms. She would be ready for him next time. When the door slid shut behind him, she let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging as the weight of what had just happened began to settle over her. The ship was safe for now, but the battle was far from over. There were still enemies out there, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. She turned back to the control panel, and for the first time allowed herself a moment of reflection. The suit was still a mystery to her, but she was beginning to understand it better. She didn't need to rely on it completely. She didn't need to lose herself to it. She could use it, but she would never be defined by it. The hum of the ship grew louder, as if in agreement, and Lyra knew that whatever came next, she would face it with the strength she'd have found within herself. Lyra stood in the silence of the control room, her eyes tracing over the damaged systems and shattered walls. Around her, the invader was gone. But the threat hadn't disappeared, not by a long shot. She knew there would be others like him out there, others who wanted the power the ship held, others who would stop at nothing to take it from her. And she couldn't let that happen. She glanced at the map displayed on the central screen. The coordinates of the remaining mercenary ships were still active. They were regrouping and would be back soon. The ship was damaged, but it wasn't finished yet. And neither was she. The suit still hummed beneath her skin, responding to her every thought, every movement. It was more than just armor now. It was part of her, her strength, her shield, but it was also a reminder of everything she could lose if she wasn't careful. Lyra took a slow breath and ran a hand through her hair. She had learned so much in such a short time about the suit, about the ship, but there was still so much she didn't know. The technology was ancient beyond comprehension, and the power it contained was unlike anything she had ever felt before. It was as though the suit was calling to her, urging her to embrace all of it, to become something more than human. But that wasn't the path she would take. She wouldn't let the suit define her. She had to stay grounded in who she was. The suit pulsed again in response to her thoughts, its energy a constant reminder of the balance she had to maintain. The power was intoxicating, and she could feel it tempting her to push further, to take control of everything around her, to bend the world to her will. But that was a temptation she wouldn't give in to, not again. Lyra turned away from the screen and walked toward the main hangar. She could feel the ship's movements beneath her feet as it shifted once more, its energy flowing through the walls like blood through veins. It was almost as if the ship had become a living thing, and she was its heart, its protector. She would do whatever it took to keep it safe, to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. As she entered the hangar, she saw the small fighter ships still in place, the ones she had discovered when she first arrived here. They were waiting for her. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't afford to stay on the ship any longer. The mercenaries would return soon, and they would be ready for her this time. She wouldn't be able to fight them all off by herself. She needed to take the fight to them. She needed to find their base, their headquarters, and destroy it before they could regroup and come after the ship again. Lyra strapped herself into one of the ships, the controls familiar, now the suit responding to her every command. She felt the power surge as the engines roared to life, and the hangar doors slowly began to open. The stars outside beckoned her forward, and with a final glance back at the ship she had come to call home, she took off into the unknown, the ship's power flowing with her as she left the safety of its walls and faced whatever awaited her out there. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. The invader was only the first of many, and Lyra knew she couldn't let her guard down, not for a second. But as she flew through the vastness of space, she realized something important. She wasn't alone anymore. The ship was with her, the suit was with her, and she had the strength to face whatever came next, no matter how difficult, no matter how impossible the journey would be. She had found her purpose, and she would never back down from it.